So in this video we're going to be talking about the business cycle and the 5 different phases within the business cycle. So the rate of economic growth measured by GDP in Australia changes in a very wave-like or basically curvy manner over a period of 5 to 8 years. So essentially Australia will generally go through each of these phases of the business cycle over a period of 5 to 8 years. So we've got an aggregate supply curve which increases at a very steady rate every single year, and that helps to determine our long rate or potential economic growth in the long term. So our long-term productive capacity, our long-term ability to supply is determined by our access to resources and of quantity and quality of resources. But the aggregate demand or level of demand for Australian goods and services will move in a cyclical or wave-like pattern. Okay? So just a couple of things to remember. I said this in class, but when we're at this point here, our economic growth is not negative. Okay, it's just slowing down compared to last year. Economic growth is only negative if you're below this line of 0%. So be really careful. It's a way that you often get tricked or way that they try and trick students by people saying that economic growth is falling at this point here, but it's really just slower than what it was before. So same at this point here. Even at this point here, economic growth is not falling. And here's economic growth in Australia. So you can see that since 1991, we haven't had any periods of negative economic growth because we're always above this 0% line. That wasn't the case in the 30s, wasn't the case in the 40s, and it wasn't the case in the mid-50s, or the early 80s, or the mid-70s. But in the last 26 years now, we haven't had any negative economic growth for a period longer than a quarter. 5 phases of the economic cycle. You need to know these in detail. Lots of multiple choice questions will go, alright, which one of these is not a phase of a peak, or which one of these is not a phase of a trough, or a phase of a contraction or an expansion. So you need to know these really well and be prepared that there will be lots of multiple choice questions related to this. So the peak phase occurs when GDP reaches its maximum. Okay, there's high level of consumer and business confidence, lots of spending in the economy, aggregate demand is outweighing aggregate supply. Okay. Generally high levels of debt because people are confident. They're willing to go into debt, they're willing to spend money, they're willing to go on holidays because they think I'm going to have a job in the future. And there's also overvalued assets during this period. Because people are willing to go into so much debt, property prices are increasing because there's a lot of demand for property. Okay? People are willing to take on debt, so more people will be bidding at your auctions, the prices of assets are going to go up during these periods. Firms are generally using as many resources as they can to produce goods and services. There's lots and lots of demand, so supply is stretched to its limit. We're close to our productive capacity. Unemployment is very low, with prices increasing. We have high inflation, we have tight labour markets. Tight labour markets means that there's not a lot of unemployment. There's not a lot of choice for businesses that want to hire people, and we generally see rising wages. So one problem for businesses of a peak phase or an economic boom, the good thing is there's lots of demand for their products. The bad thing is they're generally going to be paying their workers more money because there's not many unemployed people, so the workers essentially have the power. This is often unsustainable as the resources will run out. It also leads to a high volume of imports because we're spending lots, and when you spend at the shops, you're generally buying imports. And when you're spending more money, or if you're going on holidays, or you're buying white goods, or buying clothes, a lot of that will come from overseas. So peak phase is also associated with large trade deficits, where the value of imports is significantly more than the value of exports. Australia's last peak was a little bit different because it was caused by the mining boom, so it was actually a bit different, but generally we'll experience trade deficits, high levels of imports during the peak. Then we've got the contraction phase. The contraction phase will occur after the peak, and it's where the rate of economic growth starts to slow down. So basically in a peak we've got high inflation, we have high prices, and eventually what's going to happen is the government's going to increase interest rates to slow the economy down. The competitiveness of our exports will start to slow down because inflation is high, so our prices will be high. So eventually other countries will go, no, we don't want Australian things. So that will reduce aggregate demand. There will be wage pressures, so business will start to make less profit and therefore might start to produce less, which will start to develop into a contraction because they're not making enough profit. Overvalued assets, so people will start to realise that asset prices are too high, they'll stop borrowing so much, and therefore the economy will start to slow down. So during this contraction, firms will start to notice that people are spending less, and there's less need for them to produce. Consumer and business confidence will fall. Underutilisation rates will rise. And what I mean by that is if people aren't working as many hours as they'd like to. So we might have underutilised labour because you say you want to work 40 hours a week, but there's not much demand for labour, so there's only enough demand for you to work 10 hours a week. Or we have underutilization of capital, we're not using all our capital resources, and wage pressures will start to fall. They were high in a peak, now that the demand is starting to fall, there'll be less demand for employees, and businesses can start to pay people less. Because, hey, we can just sack the 2 people that want the highest wage and keep the cheap one. Because people aren't wanting as many of our products. Unemployment starts to rise, prices start to fall, and people start to save more and reduce their debt levels. That's some of the features of a contraction. Then we've got the trough. The trough phase occurs when production and consumption reaches its lowest level, can lead to negative rates of economic growth, often associated with high rates of unemployment. They're not using their resources, very loose labour markets, there will be low wage pressures. All of these things are associated with a trough phase of the business cycle. And if we know that if a trough lasts for more than 6 months, or 6 months of negative growth, we call this a recession. Okay, some troughs aren't negative growth, they're just slow growth, but if it's a sustained trough, it will become a recession. And then we have the expansion phase, which occurs after a trough, is where the level of GDP starts to increase again, consumption and production start to grow. So during the trough, the government might have lowered interest rates, or we talked about when we had our last trough, the government gave everyone $900. These things will start to boost economic growth again. People will start to spend more, firms will employ more resources to meet the extra demand, and therefore production will start to grow again. Okay, so we might start to see capacity constraints start to emerge again. We'll start to see lower unemployment. People will go into more debt. These things will start to happen again once we have the expansion phase. And prices will start to rise as well because shortages will start to develop again as people demand more. Okay. Troughs, we have low interest rates, low inflation, that starts to boost demand again, and the economy starts to pick up again on the back of those things. And the last phase is domestic economic stability. That's basically where demand and supply are in balance. Consumption and production sort of meet each other. Economic growth is not too fast or too slow, and we don't have excessive inflation. We're kind of working at a nice pace. Unemployment is generally at about 5%. But this phase is very temporary and sort of only occurs at sort of a midway between a peak and a trough. So we can't sustain domestic economic stability because generally something will happen. Like, China's growth might just slow down and that might affect Australia. Or something else, we might experience something that boosts growth and therefore we start to work towards a peak. But this is a very fleeting stage where there's very controlled inflation, 2 to 3% inflation, generally growth of around 3.5 to 4%, unemployment of around 5%. And the last one is just stagflation. This isn't a phase of the business cycle, but it's a very bad situation where we actually have high unemployment, low levels of growth and high inflation. And it's not associated really with aggregate demand, it's associated with weak aggregate supply conditions. So if Australia was to experience a natural disaster that wiped out a lot of our supply, it might lead to high unemployment and high inflation because we don't have money resources and therefore prices start to rise. It's very common in very poor countries that have low-skilled labour forces, poor productivity because they have to raise their prices because of a lack of output and therefore prices go up. This happened also in the 70s and 80s in Australia. We had high unemployment of about 10.2% and inflation of around 11.6%. That's mainly because our workforce wasn't productive enough.